Did you feel that drop in your stomach just now? Because 2 minutes ago, the story you thought you understood took a sharp, unsettling turn. Not a rumor, not a leak, not a breathless tabloid headline whispered through the cracks of social media. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. A confirmation. And it didn't come from an aide. It didn't come from a faceless source. It came from Prince Harry himself. Let me ask you something before we go any further. When someone who has spent years fighting the media suddenly chooses to speak, not defensively, not angrily, but quietly, what does that usually mean? It means something is very wrong. The words were few, carefully chosen, almost restrained, but the weight behind them felt crushing. A car crash, a confirmation, and a silence that followed that felt louder than any headline. At first, it didn't make sense. The timing felt off. The tone didn't match the urgency people expected. And yet, within minutes, the internet began to fracture into confusion, fear, speculation, and something else. A creeping sense of déjà vu no one wanted to acknowledge out loud. Because if you've followed this family long enough, you already know this isn't just another breaking news alert. This hits deeper. Think about it. For years, Harry has spoken about fear, about loss, about how quickly a normal day can become a permanent scar, about how a single moment on the road can rewrite a life forever. So when news broke that a car crash was involved, and when he confirmed devastating news connected to Meghan, the reaction wasn't just shock. It was dread. But here's where things get complicated. Because what was confirmed wasn't what most people expected. And what wasn't said, that's where this story truly begins. In the first few minutes after the confirmation surfaced, media outlets hesitated. Some posted vague alerts. Others waited. A few published headlines that felt oddly restrained, as if editors themselves weren't sure how far they were allowed to go. That alone should tell you something. When news is simple, it explodes instantly. When news is sensitive, dangerous, or legally complicated, it pauses. And this paused. Social media, on the other hand, did not. Screenshots flew. Clips were replayed again and again. People dissected Harry's voice, his phrasing, the gaps between sentences. Some swore he sounded shaken. Others said he sounded controlled to the point of emotional exhaustion. Ask yourself this. If you were confirming something devastating about the person you love most, something tied to a car crash, would you rush to explain everything? Or would you choose your words like stepping across thin ice? What made the moment even more unsettling was the timing. This didn't arrive after weeks of build-up. There was no gradual leak, no steady drip of rumors. It dropped suddenly, cleanly, almost surgically, which raises a question no one seemed ready to ask yet. Why now? Why this moment, of all moments, to confirm anything at all? To understand why this matters, you have to zoom out. The past few months have been tense. Public appearances carefully controlled. Communication patterns subtly shifting. Long stretches of silence where commentary used to be immediate. And beneath it all, a sense that something wasn't quite stable. Not explosively broken, but fragile, like a glass held too tightly. Then suddenly this. A car crash is not just an event. In this context, it's a trigger. It's a word loaded with history, trauma, and unresolved fear. And Harry knows that better than anyone alive. Which is why his decision to confirm devastating news connected to a crash carries far more weight than a standard celebrity update. It isn't just about what happened. It's about what it echoes. And that echo is why so many people felt a chill when they heard it. Now let's slow this down, because the next part is crucial. Despite the panic online, despite the dramatic thumbnails and speculative commentary, the confirmation itself was restrained. There were no graphic details, no blow-by-blow accounts, no emotional outburst, just enough information to tell the world that something serious had occurred, and not nearly enough to explain what it actually meant. That contradiction alone fueled chaos. Some assumed the worst. Others accused the media of exaggeration. A few insisted this was being intentionally underplayed. So which is it? Here's what we know for sure at this point in the story. There was a car crash. There was a confirmation. And the emotional weight of that confirmation suggests consequences, not just inconvenience, but everything else, still wrapped in fog. And that fog may be deliberate. Because when you're dealing with legal implications, medical privacy, and global scrutiny, silence can be a shield. A delay can be protection. And confirmation without detail can be a way to slow the narrative before it spirals out of control. Ask yourself, who benefits from clarity right now, and who benefits from restraint? That's the tension sitting at the heart of this story. What makes this moment even more striking is how quickly people began connecting dots that haven't been officially connected. Past fears, past trauma, past statements. The mind fills in gaps when information is incomplete, and sometimes those assumptions become louder than facts. But here's the thing most headlines are missing. This isn't just a story about an accident. It's a story about timing, fear, and control. It's about a man who has spent his adult life warning the world about how quickly the road can become dangerous, suddenly standing in front of that exact nightmare again. And it's about what happens when personal trauma collides with public scrutiny in real time. Now, before you jump to conclusions, let me be clear about something. Nothing you've heard so far tells the full story. Not the clips, not the headlines, not the speculation. Because there is a critical gap between what the world assumed and what Harry actually confirmed. And that gap is intentional. The reason this confirmation landed the way it did, heavy, restrained, almost haunting, is because the most important details weren't shared yet. Not because they don't exist, but because revealing them too soon would change everything. In the coming chapters, we're going to walk through this carefully, step by step, without rushing, without sensationalizing what isn't confirmed. We'll look at the timeline that doesn't quite align, the moments before the confirmation, the reactions that never made it to the public eye, and the subtle signals that suggest this situation is far more complex than a single incident on the road. But before we do any of that, there's one last question you need to sit with. Why would someone confirm devastating news without explaining it, unless the explanation itself carries consequences? Because what Harry did next wasn't about feeding the media. It was about preparing the world. And once you understand why, you'll see why this story was never going to be simple. But what was happening in the moments immediately after that confirmation, away from cameras, away from headlines, would raise even more questions. And that's where Chapter 1 begins. There are moments when the world doesn't explode. It pauses. That's what happened here. No sirens in the distance. No dramatic footage looping on every screen. No immediate flood of official statements racing to get ahead of the narrative. Just a strange, uncomfortable stillness. And that should have been the first warning sign. Because when news truly doesn't matter, it's loud. It's reckless. It spills everywhere all at once. But when news is dangerous, legally, emotionally, historically, it moves differently. Carefully. Cautiously. Almost like everyone involved is afraid of saying the wrong word too soon. That was the feeling in the minutes after Prince Harry's confirmation surfaced. People didn't scream. They stopped scrolling. You could see it in real time. Comment sections that normally filled with noise slowed down. Influencers who usually rushed to be first hesitated. Newsrooms posted partial updates, then went quiet again. It felt frozen. And for a family whose entire modern history has been defined by movement, chaos, and relentless public attention, that silence was deafening. Let's rewind to that exact moment. The confirmation didn't arrive with spectacle. There was no dramatic press conference. No long prepared statement filled with emotional language. Instead, it was short, controlled, almost surgical. That alone rattled people. Because Harry is many things in the public eye. Angry, vulnerable, outspoken, wounded. But emotionally restrained in moments of crisis? That's not what people expected. And when expectations are broken, fear fills the gap. Within seconds, timelines fractured. Some accounts reported incident. Others said accident. A few used the word crash outright. Each version carried a different emotional weight, and no one seemed certain which was correct. That confusion spread faster than facts ever could. Here's what's important to understand. The moment the confirmation went public, two very different worlds reacted at the same time. The public world, you, me, social media, headlines, reacted emotionally. But the private world reacted strategically. And those two reactions did not align. In the public space, people asked the obvious questions. Was she hurt? How serious was it? Where did it happen? Why haven't we heard more? But behind closed doors, the questions were very different. Who knows already? What can legally be said? What happens if we say too much or too little? And that's where the freeze truly set in. Because once a story reaches this level, it stops being just news. It becomes risk. Within minutes, something else happened that most viewers didn't consciously notice, but felt. The language changed. Headlines avoided specifics. Phrases like devastating news appeared without explanation. Articles referenced concerns instead of injuries. Words like confirmed appeared more often than details. That's not accidental. That's a holding pattern. And holding patterns exist for one reason: uncertainty. At this point, even the biggest outlets didn't know how far the truth extended. And when information is incomplete, responsible organizations slow down, even as irresponsible speculation speeds up. Now let me ask you something. Have you ever noticed how people behave when they're afraid of repeating history? Because that fear was everywhere in this moment. You could hear it in the careful phrasing. You could see it in the hesitation to speculate. You could feel it in the collective intake of breath that followed the word car. For most families, a car crash is tragic. For this family, it's existential. And everyone knows it, whether they say it out loud or not. That's why this moment landed like it did. Not as breaking news, but as a reopened wound. As minutes passed, a pattern began to emerge. Certain voices stayed quiet. Certain commentators, usually quick to react, went completely silent. Others posted once, then deleted. A few hinted at knowing more, but refused to elaborate. That's never a coincidence. Silence, especially selective silence, often signals internal instructions, which leads us to an uncomfortable possibility that the story unfolding in public was already outdated. Because when confirmation reaches us, it usually comes after a storm has already passed privately. Think about that. By the time you hear confirmed, decisions have been made. Reactions have happened. Consequences are already being managed. So what exactly were they managing here? At this early stage, the only thing that was clear was that Harry wasn't reacting. He was stabilizing. And that distinction matters. He wasn't lashing out. He wasn't blaming. He wasn't pleading for privacy. He was setting boundaries. That suggests forethought. And forethought suggests that this moment had been anticipated. At least emotionally, if not situationally. Which raises a chilling question. Was this fear always sitting there, waiting for a trigger? As the hour progressed, the world tried to fill the vacuum. Old interviews resurfaced. Past statements were clipped and replayed. People drew lines between unrelated events. The narrative began to stretch, warp, and multiply. But notice something important. Despite all the noise, no new official details emerged. No clarifications. No corrections. No expansions. Just silence. And silence at this level is never empty. It's loaded. Because while the public speculated, private conversations were unfolding at speed. Lawyers, advisors, medical professionals, security teams, each one operating under different rules, different risks, and different priorities. And somewhere in the middle of all that, a family processing something deeply personal while knowing the world was watching every move. That tension between human reaction and public expectation is where this story truly lives. And it's why the moment the world froze wasn't dramatic. It was controlled, almost too controlled. Which brings us to the most unsettling part of this chapter. The confirmation itself did not escalate. It didn't evolve. It didn't expand. It didn't soften or intensify. It stayed exactly as it was. That tells us something. Because when news is misunderstood, people rush to clarify. When news is exaggerated, people rush to downplay. But when news is accurate and dangerous, people hold. They wait. They watch reactions. They assess damage. And they prepare for what comes next. So let me ask you directly. If the confirmation was only the beginning, what was everyone bracing for? Because the way this moment unfolded suggests that the real shock wasn't the crash itself. It was what the crash represented. And whatever that is, it was serious enough to make the entire machine slow down. In the next chapter, we're going to examine the words themselves, not what they said, but how they were said. The pauses, the omissions, the choices. Because buried inside that confirmation is a signal most people missed. And once you see it, you'll understand why this moment wasn't chaotic. It was calculated. But what Harry chose not to say, and why, would raise even more questions. And those questions would change everything.